Forget the fairy tales about mighty sultans. Behind the glittering splendor of their palaces lies a truth history books rarely tell. The truth of a ruthless state machine that for centuries turned human beings into merchandise. What really awaited women after their cities fell? We won't show you the chaos of battle, but the cold calculations of a system where human lives were written up like invoices. You'll witness the degrading auctions of the slave markets, where women's teeth were inspected like livestock before a price was set. We'll open the doors of the Sultan's harem, not an oriental dream of pleasure, but a gilded prison with deadly rules of survival. How was a woman stripped of her name, her language, her faith, her past, until she became nothing more than a beautiful but voiceless shadow? And finally, we'll reveal the darkest, most shameful secret of this system. What happened to the children born in captivity, and why the sacred gift of motherhood became the most terrible of curses. This is the story of how one of the greatest empires of the world built its power on a foundation people prefer not to speak of today. Stay with us until the end. We promise your view of history will never be the same. In 1521, the mighty walls of Belgrade, a shield of Christian Europe for centuries, shook in their death throes. The thunder of Ottoman cannons, the most powerful in the world at the time, roared without pause, turning days and nights into one endless, deafening nightmare. For weeks, the exhausted defenders, starved and sleepless, peered down from the battlements. What they saw was not just an army, but an entire moving city, a war machine of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent at the height of its power. The sky blackened with smoke, the air thick with the stench of fire, dust, and despair. Through the streets of the besieged city rang cries that had long since lost any note of hope, blending into one endless wail of the condemned. When the final defenses collapsed and the janissaries, silent, unstoppable, like fate itself, poured through the breaches, it seemed the worst had already come. Blood and flames ended the story of a free city, but in truth, that was only the beginning. For the women of the fallen, for their daughters and their mothers, the end of battle brought neither quick death nor merciful oblivion. The roar of cannons gave way to a silence, heavy and sticky, like blood drying on stone. And in that silence, a new, calculated terror began. The victors did not move through the city like a wild horde drunk on victory. They moved with frightening order and precision. And then other figures appeared, not warriors in bloody armor, but officials in spotless robes, holding wooden tablets and pens. They were accompanied by doctors whose eyes held no pity, only professional interest. Families, clinging desperately to each other, were separated with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. A mother's arms wrapped tight around her daughter, and the hand of an official, not brutal, but inexorable, prying those fingers apart to record the girl's age and note the condition of the prize. This was not looting, this was inventory. What followed was not an outbreak of rage, but the first stage of a perfectly oiled machine, a conveyor belt that turned people into property and human lives into revenue for the imperial treasury. Women who just yesterday ruled their own homes were stripped in an instant of everything, their families, their houses, their honor, and worst of all, their very names. What awaited them was a fate many considered worse than death by the sword. They became living trophies, raw material for a merciless system. This was no accident of war. It was doctrine, refined through decades of conquest and enshrined in the laws of Sharia. To understand how it worked, we must look under the hood of this monstrous engine. How did a state policy turn conquest into a conveyor belt of human lives, operating with terrifying efficiency, swallowing hundreds of thousands of women whose voices history chose to forget? The answer lies not on battlefields, but in the quiet offices where imperial scribes, with a cold stroke of the pen, decided who would live and who would vanish forever. The cruelty that descended upon the women of Belgrade was not the blind byproduct of war, it was law. At the core of this system stood the deeply entrenched legal and religious concept of sabaya, women captured in war. For the Ottoman state, this was not an excuse for violence, but a way to regulate it. There were strict rules that determined the sultan's share, the commander's share, and the soldier's share. Captive women were not just spoils, they were resources, accounted for, classified, and distributed with the same meticulous care as gold coins or sacks of grain. The moment the guns fell silent, the human inventory began. Special officials and their aides combed through the captured city, street by street, house by house. Men capable of bearing arms were usually dispatched quickly, but women and children were herded into central squares or large enclosed courtyards. There, in the open air, under each other's terrified eyes, the second stage began: sorting. This process was carried out with clinical detachment, stripped of all emotion. Doctors who accompanied the army examined women as veterinarians inspect livestock before a fair. They noted everything: age, teeth, signs of illness, physical strength, and of course, beauty. Young and attractive women were immediately separated. A chalk mark on their clothing or a ribbon tied around the wrist could mark them as high-value goods, destined for the sultan's harem, his viziers, or for sale at the most expensive markets of the capital. Those who were older but still strong were marked for heavy household labor in the homes of officials or officers. Their worth was measured in endurance and obedience. The elderly and the frail in the eyes of this system held almost no value at all, and were often left with the most degrading and filthy tasks within the garrisons themselves. Every woman received an unspoken category, and scribes methodically entered the details into thick registry books. Names, origins, past lives, none of it mattered anymore. They were now nothing more than a line in the ledger of a military campaign. After the sorting came the next stage, the road of no return. Captives were gathered into massive caravans and driven under guard deep into the empire. The journey, often stretching hundreds of kilometers, was itself a form of torture and natural selection. They were forced to march on foot, chained together in groups, across sun-scorched plains and freezing mountain passes. Food and water were given only in amounts just enough to keep them from collapsing too quickly. The march became the first and harshest filter. The weak, the sick, or those who lost the will to endure simply did not survive. They were left by the roadside as the caravan pressed on without pause. With every mile, they were dragged farther from home, from their past, and from any last shred of hope. This was not mere transport from point A to point B. It was a deliberate process of psychological breaking. By the time the exhausted, filthy, hollow-eyed captives finally glimpsed the distant minarets of great cities, Istanbul, Bursa, Ankara, there was no trace left of their will to resist. They had arrived at the heart of the empire, only to discover their suffering was far from over. Ahead loomed the gates of the great slave market, the place where the last spark of hope vanished like morning mist over the Bosphorus. The grand slave market of Istanbul, located in the very heart of the bustling capital near the Grand Bazaar, bore little resemblance to the chaotic, dirty fairs on the empire's fringes. No, this was a solid, well-regulated institution, operating under strict rules and bringing staggering revenues to the treasury. It was an entire district, walled and self-contained, with its own courtyards, storage areas, and even a rudimentary system of guarantees for buyers. For the thousands of captives who survived the march, its gates marked the final boundary. separating them from complete and irreversible oblivion. Inside this world, governed entirely by the logic of commerce, awaited the last stage of preparing the goods for sale. Women were scrubbed of the dust of the road, given plain but clean garments, and offered meager food to restore a semblance of health. This was not care, but pre-sale polishing, the way furniture might be cleaned before being placed in a shop window. Then they were led out into the courtyards and made to stand on wooden platforms under the sharp, appraising eyes of dozens of buyers who strolled leisurely among the rows of human merchandise. Here, on this dreadful stage, unfolded a theater of humiliation perfected to ritual. A buyer, whether a wealthy merchant, an influential official, or a eunuch sent from the palace, had the right to the most intrusive inspection. He could force a woman's mouth open to check her teeth, press her arms and legs to test muscle strength, or make her walk back and forth to see if she limped. Through a translator, he might even ask her a few simple questions to gauge wit or submission. Every glance, every movement, every tear became part of this grotesque performance, designed to break their will and make clear they were now nothing more than objects, their worth defined only by supply and demand. Traders shouted their praises as though advertising wares. Young, healthy, from a noble Serbian family, skilled in embroidery, or strong and durable, perfect for heavy garden work. And the woman stood frozen in terror and shame, hearing her fate bargained over in a language she did not even understand. Then the bidding began. Prices rose and fell. Fortunes decided in moments or after long, heated debates. The sharp crack of the auctioneer's hammer struck like a sentence, final, unappealable. From that moment on, she had a new master. She was led away from the stage, making room for the next. For most women sold here, life meant endless, back-breaking labor in the grand houses of Istanbul, in kitchens, laundries, or in service to the wives and concubines of their masters. It was a slow fading into obscurity. But for the youngest, most beautiful, and most expensive captives, the market was only a stopover. Another path awaited them, one far more mythologized and far more terrifying. Their fate lay beyond the high walls of Topkapi Palace or in the mansions of the Ottoman elite. They were destined for the harem, a word that, in European imagination, was wrapped in fantasies of silk and pleasure, but to the captives themselves meant something entirely different. Not reward, but the next, even more refined level of captivity. They entered a gilded cage where survival required not strength of body, but the art of intrigue, the ability to read a master's desires, and the relentless struggle for a sliver of favor in a world where the only currency was the Sultan's fleeting attention. How could a woman survive inside the most powerful and most dangerous household in the empire? Once inside Topkapi's walls, a girl stepped into a world that bore no resemblance to romantic tales of perfumes and velvet. The harem was not paradise, but a machine, a glittering, merciless mechanism with its own rigid rules, where the true measure was not beauty or talent, but the instinct to survive. It was a nest of serpents, where hundreds of women brought from across the world waged a quiet but deadly war for the grace of a single man, the Sultan. The first thing stripped from a new arrival was her past. This process was polished to perfection. Her name, the last link to her family and her home, was taken away. In its place, she received a new Turkish name, often with a poetic meaning: Gulbahar, spring rose, or Mahpeker, moon-faced. It was the first step in erasing identity. Next, she was forbidden to speak her native tongue. Any language but Ottoman Turkish was strictly banned. Her faith, too, had to be uprooted. Conversion to Islam was demanded, sometimes coaxed, sometimes forced. Then began the long, exhausting training. She was not taught sciences or arts in the European sense. She was taught to be the perfect concubine, to move gracefully, to speak politely, to play instruments, to dance, and above all, to master the art of pleasing her master. It was not education, but conditioning, a full rewriting of the self, meant to turn a free human being into an obedient, ornamental shadow whose only purpose in life was to give pleasure. Life in the harem was governed by an iron hierarchy. At the top stood the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, a woman of immense power. Below her were his official wives, then the favored concubines, the Iqbals, who bore his children. At the bottom, in the dust beneath their feet, were the ordinary concubines, the odalisques, and the newest recruits, the Hashemi. A careless glance or a single misplaced word could bring brutal punishment and a fall to the lowest rung, from which there was no return. Resistance, under such conditions, was almost impossible, but it did exist. Some refused food, starving themselves into weakness. Others risked punishment by whispering prayers to their old gods or speaking their mother tongue. But the system was designed to crush any trace of will. The defiant were thrown into palace dungeons, flogged, or subjected to refined psychological torments crafted to break the spirit. Many could not endure. With no escape from the golden cage, some lost their minds. Others ended their life by choice. Yet the most chilling, most final step in the chain was conversion to Islam. This was not only spiritual, it was legal. By accepting the new faith, a woman permanently lost any right to return home. Even if her family sought to ransom her, Ottoman law forbade a Muslim woman from being handed back to the infidels. It was the last door closing forever behind her, sealing her as the empire's eternal property. From that moment, her body, her soul, and even her future children belonged not to her, but to her master. The most insidious part of this system was that it did not end with one generation. It was designed as a perpetual engine, reproducing itself. By law, children born to a slave mother automatically became the property of her master. Motherhood, which anywhere else would be a source of joy, here became another chain. A woman carried, birthed, and raised a child that was never truly hers. At any moment, that child could be sold, gifted, or torn away forever at the whim of the owner. Perhaps no cruelty struck deeper because it attacked not the body, but the very essence of humanity, turning the sacred act of motherhood into an instrument of profit and the perpetuation of slavery. Step back from the tragedies of individuals, and the wider consequences come into focus. This was a demographic disaster stretching across centuries. Hundreds of thousands of women were torn from their communities in the Balkans, Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and the Mediterranean. Entire regions where unique cultural and ethnic identities had formed over generations lost whole cohorts of young women. Their demographic balance, their gene pools, their social fabric, all were changed forever. Villages left with only old men and children decayed into ruin. Nations whose strength was in continuity were bled dry. And perhaps the most shocking element of all was the system's bureaucratic precision. This was not the chaos of a savage horde, it was savagery harnessed by civilization, organized, recorded, and codified. In the Ottoman archives, thousands of registries still survive, written in perfect calligraphy, recording the details of this conveyor belt. These documents carry no emotion, only cold fact. One girl, 15 years old, from the Hungarian town of Eger, healthy,
Fair hair, sold for 500 akça. Each stroke of the pen marked the end of a life as it once was. These archives are not mere records. They are vast libraries of human suffering, proof of how a state machine can legitimize and systematize evil, transforming crime into routine administration. The legacy of this system proved as deep and enduring as the suffering it inflicted. It not only redrew the ethnic map of vast territories, but also carved lasting scars into the collective memory of entire peoples. Stories of the Turkish yoke were passed down from generation to generation, woven into national folklore, shaping the image of the enemy for centuries to come. Today, as we live in a world still struggling for human rights and dignity, this history speaks to us as a grim reminder that progress is never guaranteed and that humanity's capacity for systematic evil, wrapped in laws and regulations, remains a constant threat. The memory of those nameless victims whose identities were erased and whose lives were reduced to mere lines in a ledger compels us to stay vigilant against any ideology, any system that dares to treat human beings as property.